Well, when I was 13 years old, actually I was 12, and that was in 1954. My brother-in-law, whose name was Carol Jarvis, and my sister Carla, uh, he was a miner out to Cobalt in the mines, and he had an opportunity to lease the gasoline station that was out there in the little town of Cobalt. So he took that opportunity to get out of the mines, and he needed a little extra help. So he did that in the fall of 1954.
Uh-huh.
And like I said, I was about 12, and I turned 13 in August, and I went out there to work for him when I was 12. Uh, I went out as soon as school was out at the end of May. So May and June I was 12, and then I turned 13 in August 3rd, and worked for the rest of that summer. And then uh, when winter came and school started back in Salmon, I I went to school, but I bought a car. Keeping in mind now, I was still 13. In
Yeah.
those days, that you couldn't get a driver's license till you're 14. But I had this job out to Cobalt over the mountains. If you can imagine driving over the mountains where the road was covered with snow and all of that when you're a 13-year-old kid. But I did it all that winter. And then just a little side story. The following summer, when I turned 14, I went in to get my driver's license. And Bill Baker, the sheriff, said, "Do you know how to drive, boy?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Yeah, I know. I've been watching you for about a year." Anyway, that's how it was in small town Idaho, in those days,
Yeah.
back in the mid 50s. Anyhow, getting back to Cobalt, I was just a kid and I didn't know much, a 13-year-old kid. What do you know? And I learned how to pump gas, learned how to change oil, do all the kind of stuff you do when you're servicing a car. That's held me in good stead my whole life. And miners, not all of them, they all don't fit this mode, but the ones that Carla and Carol, my sister and her husband, run around with, fit the mold that I'm about ready to reveal. And that was hardworking, hard living, hard fighting, hard drinking miners. About quite a few of them were single, some of them were married. Uh, but every Friday and Saturday night, if they weren't working, they were at the rec hall partying. And Carlin Carroll was kind of in that niche. And so because of that, I got to know a lot of those guys. And along about 11, 12 o'clock at night on Friday night and Saturday night, the fights would start because those kind of guys would get drunk and then anything would set them off and they'd decide to fight. So here I was, you know, 14-year-old kid out there watching those grown men fight all the time, every weekend. And it was kind of fun to watch.
Yeah.
But pretty, miners, they're tough guys. They're not wusses, they're pretty tough guys. You have to be a pretty tough, pretty strong, pretty able to go underground and work, and a lot of courage it takes. But anyway, so during those years, I was there until I was. I think I quit when I was 17. So I was there about 3 years every summer, and all winter I'd drive over and work on the weekends only, Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday until just about dark, and then I'd get in my car and go back to Salmon. And just a side note, that first winter, uh, now you were talking about 11,000-foot pass you have to go up over. Dirt road, one lane road mostly. And so you'd meet somebody, you'd have to squeeze by them, and covered with snow. And my dad was the road grader operator on that mountain, and he kept it a good snow road. And if you don't know what a good snow road is, it's not as slick as an ice road. And your tires, especially, everybody had snow tires. So if you behave yourself and drive right, you could make it okay, no problem. But I
Mm.
ran off the road 3 times that first winter till I learned that you got to slow down when you come to a turn. But I learned and became a pretty good snow driver, as good as anybody else probably. And now getting back to the parties at the rec hall, and then up the road about 3 miles out of Cobalt, just up Panther Creek, was a little tavern, and it was called Bruno's. And you could go into Bruno's and buy beer. They didn't sell hard liquor because they didn't have a license to, but they could sell beer. And they also served hamburgers and short order stuff like that.
Yeah.
So between the rec hall and Bruno's, why uh, we'd travel back and forth in our car, me and a bunch of my buddies. The uh, gosh, I can't remember all their names now. The Weedrick boys, they were a little bit older than me, but we still kind of run around together, and several other guys.
You
Us
mentioned when I
kids.
was a kid, you had some stories about Parley Fox. Was he one of those kids up there at
Oh
that
yeah,
time?
Parley was there. His dad was a worked in the mines for a while, and then he ran the restaurant in the rec hall. Him and
Oh,
his wife. But yeah, Parley was there, and Parley and I were pretty good friends. But he was a screwball. He's kind of a kid you enjoyed being around because he was make you laugh all the time. But we weren't really good buddies. He was kind of a dingbat,
yeah.
and I can say that because he's dead, and I'm sure his parents are too. I know Parley died several years ago.
Oh,
But anyway, uh, those were the days when I grew up, as my formative years, as they call them. And, from the age of about 13 till I was 17, 17 and a half or so. And I saw a lot of things that kids that age don't normally see. And it was because I was working out there on the weekends and then all summer in a mining camp. And like I said a minute ago, minings are a different breed. Miners in those days, I don't know how they are nowadays. But in those days, they were a different breed. Now there were married miners that had their families there, and they didn't go to the rec hall and do all that stuff. But just the single guys, and then some of the married guys whose wives had come to the rec hall with them and party with them.
would Carolyn and Carla go down there often, or
Oh yeah,
they
like
had
every
little
Friday
kids though
night.
about that time, didn't they?
Yeah, they had some little kids, and they'd put the kids to sleep.
Oh,
And then whenever any of us would drive past the house on our way to Bruno's or on the way back from Bruno's, we'd stop and see if the kids were still asleep. And the oldest daughter, the oldest girl was Nina. She was about 7 years old, and if the other kids woke up, they knew enough to wake Nina up so she could keep an eye on them till a grown up showed up. Can you imagine raising kids like that?
it wouldn't work today.
No, no, it wouldn't work today. But there was a guy named Bob Patton. He was a big guy, probably 6 foot, probably 250 or 60, and he loved to fight. And every Friday or Saturday night, he'd usually get in a fight. He'd get about half drunk, and then he'd get mean and insulting and obnoxious. But when he was sober, he said one of the nicest guys you'd ever meet. When he'd get drunk, he'd get ornery. And he had a glass jaw. What that means is if you hit him in the jaw, it'll knock him out cold. And so it was common to see Bob laying on the floor over there against the wall. When somebody had hit him and knocked him out, well, we'd drag him over to the wall so he'd get off the dance floor.
Yeah.
The rec hall had a gymnasium, and that was the dance floor. And pretty soon he'd wake up and stir around a little bit and get up and wouldn't know what happened to him. He couldn't remember. And that's just one example. There was another guy, and he's still alive, and I hope he don't mind me telling this story. But the Weedrick brothers, there was Frank Weedrick and Bob Weedrick, and at that time I was about seventh, eighth, ninth grader, 10th grader, 11th grader, and Bob Weedrick was a few years older than me. So when I was like a ninth grader, he would have been a senior, and he was a big big kid. He was about 6'5" and probably weighed 240, 220, 230. And he'd go to the dances, and he's a nice person, but you didn't want to cross him or get in his way. Because he was a big old raw boned kid that was that young, some of the miners would hear that he was tough and they wanted to try him out. They'd get about half drunk and they'd try Bob out. And that was a mysterious mistake because he was a one punch man.
Yeah.
And Bob would haul off and hit him and knock him groggy if he didn't knock him completely out cold. But then that wasn't good enough for him. He'd pick them up and stand them on their feet and hit them again. And then he'd pick them back up and hit. And his brother Frank came along, and Frank was a little older than Bob, and he fought all the time. The two guys were toughest guys you ever knew. And Frank could grab Bob and stop him before he killed somebody. When Frank get in a fight and he'd knock him out, he'd leave him laying there. He wouldn't keep on him.
Yeah.
But back in those days, the company would transport during the summer months. They would transport a lot of college kids, guys that were probably majoring in mining or engineering or some of those trades that are related to being a miner. And those college kids would come to Cobalt for the summer and work, and they all thought they were smart, and they'd want to get drunk, and they'd want to do this and they'd want to do that. And I never saw any of them that were tough.
Yeah.
They didn't know what tough was till they ran into Bob Weidrich or Frank Weidrich or some of those kind of guys.
Yeah.
I mean, those Weidrich kids grew up in a mining camp.
Yeah.
And from the time they're big enough to walk, they were big enough to start swinging their fists. Anyway, it was pretty common every Friday night or Saturday night or both nights for the Weidrich boys to come in, and they didn't go looking for trouble. They weren't troublemakers, but they didn't back up 1 inch either. And the college kids that were there were all a little older than the Weidrich boys. Frank was Frank was out of high school, but he was like 20, 21.
Mm-hmm.
And those college kids would be, in their early 20s, and they thought they were pretty tough, and they'd drink 2 or 3 beers, and boy, they really got tough then. And they'd find out those Weidrich boys liked to fight or would fight or were tough, and they wanted to try them out. And that was always a mistake, because pretty near every Friday night or every Saturday night, why the Weidrich kids would beat the living heck out of somebody.
Yeah.
And it was usually those college kids, all the miners and stuff. They knew the Weidrich boys' dad, and they were all friends, and they liked the Weidrich kids because they were nice kids.
Yeah.
You just didn't want to mess with them. You had any sense, you'd stay away from them. And
now, Dad, I graduated with one of the Weidrich boys. Robert was my age.
That's right. Yeah.
Married that little Havman girl.
Yeah.
Where does he fit in the family? Do you know?
Well, that's the one I'm referring to as Bob Weidrich.
But would that be his dad? Because Robert was my age, graduated
the kid,
in
Bob Weidrich,
82.
that was your age, or the Robert Weidrich, was he would have to be probably Frank's son.
Okay.
Frank was going with a girl, and I think they got married. And he would have, because their son would have been about the same age as my son, which would be you.
Yeah.
So that's who he was.
Okay.
And
yeah, we were good friends.
But that's just a couple of examples. There was a kid named can't remember his name. He thought he was really tough, though. He was from Nevada. His dad was a miner, and I'll think of his name here before I get through talking. And he thought he was awful tough, and he was a big old, tall, raw-boned kid. And but when he tangled with Frank Weidrich, well, all the tough went right out of him. And he wasn't so tough anymore after that. He quit throwing his weight around and trying to be a smart aleck. And in fact, I had to run in with him once. And this is probably going to reveal something about me that maybe you know, maybe you don't know. But he was a couple of years older than me, and he was about 6'2" or 3. And this was probably when I was about 16, 17. And I can't remember exactly what happened, but oh, yes, I do too. He had a younger brother named Robert, and I'll think of his last name in a minute. And Robert came to school in Salmon during the week, and then he'd go home on the weekends to Cobalt.
Hmm.
And my sister Sherry and I were walking down the street, and Robert was sitting there in a car at the curb, and we come walking by, and he had a bean shooter, and he shot her in the rear end with a little pellet. And of
Uh,
course, it hurt her, and it made her mad. And she turned around. He's sitting there with a big smirk on his face, like he thought he'd really done something funny. And that was a mistake. He she was going to go over and jerk him out of the car and beat the crap out of him. And I said, "No, Sherry, you're too old. You'll get arrested for beating him up. He's not 18, but I can beat him up." So I went over and I dragged him out of the window, out through the window. I didn't open the door. I just reached in and grabbed by the hair and the collar and dragged him out the window. And I took that pea shooter away from him and folded it up. It was one of those plastic things you blow it like a straw.
yeah.
I folded it up and I stuffed it in his mouth. And I said, "And every time I see you from now on, expect that to be in your mouth, buddy." And his nose was bleeding and his ear was torn loose and a few things. Well, that weekend, Friday night, Cobalt, his older brother, Bob, Bob, whatever his name wasn't Weidrich. I'll think of it in a minute. Lee, last name was Lee, Bob Lee.
Lee.
He come looking for me because his little brother went home and told him how mean I was to him that week and stuff, And
Yeah.
I was in the rec hall dancing with somebody, and he come in and come up behind me, and he grabbed me by the shoulder and jerked me around. He said, "Okay, outside. I'm going to teach you a lesson for beating up on my little brother." I said, "Are you sure?" "Yep, I'm sure." I said, "Well, okay, let's go." And so he was an idiot. We uh we were going we were going out, and the gymnasium where we all danced was a one up a story. So to get outside, you had to go down a set of stairs. And there was the front stairs, which big, wide veranda type stairs, and then the back stairs was a narrow hallway with pretty steep flight of stairs. And at the bottom, you got hold of the doorknob and you pulled the door toward you, like you do in snow country. You
Yeah.
don't push the door open because you might not be able to.
Yeah.
So we got to the bottom of the stairs, and he was in front. He was so sure of himself.
Yeah.
And I was behind him, and here was a whole pack of kids behind me that were coming to watch what was going to happen. And I can't believe I did this. Uh, when he got to the bottom of the stairs, he did just what I thought he would do. He reached out and he grabbed the doorknob, and he opened the door, and he turned around to say something to me. And I'd held back about 3 steps. And when he turned around, I kicked him right in the mouth. And I knocked these two front teeth right out. And blood was spraying everywhere. And he fell down on his hands and knees, holding his mouth and spitting teeth and blood and everything else. And I said, "Bob," his name was Bob. What the crap was he? Robert was his name.
Uh-huh.
I said, "There's something you need to understand. First one is, I don't fight fair. If I get in a fight, I fight to win the fight. I don't fight fair. And the second thing you need to know is you never turn your back on somebody when you've challenged them to a fight. Have you learned that?" And I said, "Okay." And I went back up and went on with the dance. He went home, and anyway, that was the end of that story. But that's kind of the hard-nosed, ornery kid I was back in those days before I met your mother.
Well, that's kind of how things were. I
Yeah,
mean, that was a different time, different life. I
yeah,
mean, even as a young kid growing up in Salmon, I remember every summer during rodeo season, especially, the cowboys and the hippies would be fighting everywhere on
yeah.
Main Street, over at the fairgrounds, everywhere else.
Oh, yeah,
And those were some pretty fascinating scenes.
yeah.
So yeah,
Well,
it's kind of that same mentality of
yeah.
just fight to win.
Well, years later, after I grew up and was married and had a family, you might know this fact. You might have been there. I worked for a boating company that they had a lot of boatmen come in, most of them from Utah, good LDS kids, and they'd come in and run the boats, row the boats on the Salmon River all summer.
Yeah.
I got to know them. They were friends of mine. And there was a warehouse up on the bar. We called it the warehouse. It was where we kept the boats and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I was there one day. It was during the rodeo, Salmon River Days rodeo. And here come one of the boatmen, and he was all bloody. He'd mouthed off at some cowboy downtown and got in a fight and got whooped. And the worst thing about it was that he had this bear hide thing that he always wrapped around himself. It was a real bear skin.
Nice.
They took that away from him,
Oh no.
and he wanted to go get it back. And so he got the boatmen to go with him. And they said, "Come on, Mike, join us. I'm going to teach these cowboys a lesson." I said, "Nope, nope. I'll stay right here. I'll be here to patch you guys up when you get back after a while." "What do you mean? We row boats." I said, "You've never fought a cowboy, have you?" I said, "Well, you're going to learn some valuable lessons today. Because there's two things cowboys do. One of them is ride bucking horses or bulls, and the other thing they do is fight. So be prepared." So they went downtown in about a half hour. They came back all bloody, and one of them was a pre-med student at BYU or somewhere, and he sewed all the other ones up where they had their cut lips and broken nose and slashed open eyebrows and stuff. They never did get the bear hide, I don't believe it.
No.
It's
Some
probably some cowboy's truck or even today.
yeah, he still has it. Probably still has a good story to tell.
I
Everybody
imagine.
will listen.
Anyway, I'm sorry I kind of got off track here and got away
No,
from Cobalt.
that's good.
But
So
anyway, those
tell
miners were great guys, but they weren't anyone to fool around with. You left them alone, and the ones that would get drunk and want to fight, like the one I told you about, uh, that's what a lot of guys do when they get drunk. It changes their personality.
yeah,
They get to thinking they're a lot tougher than they really are, and they usually find out that, you know. But he never did learn. Bob Patton was his name.
uh-huh.
Bob never did learn. He'd every Friday night he'd get the hell beat out of him by somebody.
And then
And
have to go to work on Monday.
and he was a big guy.
Yeah,
Shouldn't have been able to whip him, but that was he didn't understand that it isn't how big you are or any of that. It's how much grit you've got
yeah,
and how smart you are at it, you know, and how good you are at it. And I learned that from Harry Hicks,
yeah,
you know. And then another thing I learned from Harry Hicks is you never, ever stand there and let somebody hit you first. You figure it's going to be a fight, you start right in, but catch the other guy completely by surprise. And by the time he's not surprised anymore, he's usually on the ground and don't want to fight anymore either,
yeah.
you know. So,
Speaking of Harry, I read his life history, and he claims, and he backed it up with dates and names and times. Sometime I'll grab it and look at it closer, but he claimed that he was the first actual miner, not the first worker, but the first actual miner that went to work in the Blackbird Mine. What do you know about that?
I know that's true. That's true. We lived in Butte. Dad was a Butte miner. And no, let's see. We'd moved from there back to Patterson, Idaho, which
Okay.
is up above May, up the Pacific River.
Yeah.
He was a miner up in Patterson, and he heard through the grapevine that this company called the Clara Mining Company had come in to the mountains and discovered a huge deposit of cobalt. And that was back Korean War times, and they needed cobalt. They used it in making weapons.
Uh-huh.
It's hardened steel. It's an ingredient you put in a steel to harden it. And it's also, cobalt was also a low grade radioactive ore.
Okay.
Not high enough grade to hurt you any, but low enough grade that it'd run a Geiger counter.
Oh.
Anyway, they set up this mine and they were hiring miners. My dad heard about it and he was tired of us living up to Patterson. Actually, Mom and us kids lived in Salmon and he'd come home on the weekends. He
Uh-huh.
was sick and tired of that. And he also heard that they were building housing or putting in housing up there to the Blackbird Mine. That was before Cobalt ever existed.
Yeah.
And the reason they named it Cobalt is that the ore they was mining. Anyway, Dad went right out there and asked for a job, and they hired him, and he was the first actual miner, first underground miner that ever worked at the Blackbird Mine. Now they had
Interesting.
other guys there ahead of him, but they were mill workers or they were bosses or they were this or that or something else. But they were hiring miners, and that's what they were looking for. And he had several years' experience from the Butte mines and then the Ima mine in Patterson, and so he got right on. And the next thing you know, we're living in a Quonset hut in Cobalt.
So what year would that have been, Dad? Do you remember? Late 40s,
It
probably?
would have been about 1949.
Okay.
Yeah, see, I was born in 42, and I started school at Cobalt, or at Blackbird, I should. Cobalt wasn't there yet, uh, which was 6 years later. So it was 42 on top of six is 48. So it was 1948
Okay.
when Dad went to work out to Blackbird Mine because
So
I
when
started
you were a
school
little
that.
elementary kid,
Hmm?
talk a little bit about your experience as a little elementary kid or a little kid playing around the
Oh,
would later become Cobalt.
well, for the first few years, Blackbird Mine is where everybody lived. They put in
Yeah.
Quonset huts up there, and people would live in them, and they'd put a bathroom, or not a bathroom. We had outdoor privies, but a water line and all that baloney.
Uh-huh.
We lived in that, and then they built Cobalt, which was about 15 miles down the road where a big flat area was along Panther Creek.
Yeah.
That came later. But I was just a, little kid out there, 6, 7 years old. And I had an older sister named Carla, and another named Sherry, and a brother named Lonnie. And the four of us kids were there together, and we'd look out for each other. And I remember in the wintertime, the snow would, I don't know how deep it was. I have a picture somewhere in our stuff of Lonnie and I sitting on the crossbar on the clothesline.
Uh-huh.
So it'd be about 5 feet, 6 feet up, just high enough for my mother to hang clothes. And we were sitting on that with our feet on the snow bank. So it's 4.5 or 5 feet of snow at least.
Wow.
And I remember that. And the snow would melt a little in the heat of the day. And then at night it'd crust over. And one time I remember breaking through the crust and falling down into the snow. And under the crust, the snow is real granular, fine and granular, like falling into a big old bucket of wheat or something.
Yeah.
And I fell down in there, and Carla and Sherry already knew that if if one of the kids falls in there, you get them out of there some ways, because it's way below zero under that snow crust, and they won't be down there very long, and they'll freeze.
Yeah.
And so every once in a while, somebody would fall through, and it was usually a little kid, because the big kids didn't have sense enough to be careful where they were walking.
Yeah.
Little kids, you know how they are; they just run up in the snow to play, and next thing you know, they're looking up there at a place where they fell through.
Yeah.
I distinctly remember that happening to me one time, and I was really cold, and all the snow just kind of collapses with you. So I was looking up where I'd fallen through, and there was a round hole in the crust up there, about big enough for me to fall through, where I broke through.
Yeah.
But Carla and Sherry got me out of there. But that was an interesting growing up time for little kids that young. We used to, there was a former mine, an old copper mine that was up there in that same area. And we'd go up that old copper mine and hang around and play. And there's a lot of mine shafts. And my memory tells me they were like 6 or 7 feet square, and a shaft that goes down completely dark. You don't know how deep it is.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they had those mine shafts is ventilation shafts, is what they were. You run your tunnel into the mountain, but then pretty soon you run out of air. Now nowadays they pump air in, so they don't have to do that.
Yeah.
In those days they'd drill a shaft down so fresh air could circulate through the mine, so the
Okay.
miners down there wouldn't suffocate or get poisoned by poison gas. Anyway, we'd go jumping across those shafts. Can you imagine us being stupid enough to do stuff like that?
Because those
Yeah.
vertical shafts, you don't know how deep they are. They
No,
might be,
no.
they might, there might never be a bottom to them. I
Well,
mean, when you think about
that's true.
it.
Well, one time Carla and some of the older kids put a rope around me, tied it up. They had about, I don't know how long it was. They lowered me down the mine shaft to see if I could reach the bottom.
Wow.
And I can clearly remember being on that rope. I was just a little kid, about 6, 7 years old. And I was dangling down in there and I was looking up. And Carla said, "Don't worry, I won't drop you." I trusted her. I knew she
Yeah.
wouldn't drop me. They lowered me down as far as the rope would go. And I was looking up and I could see him looking over in there. And I was swinging on that rope down there. Finally, they run out of rope, so they pulled me back up. And Mom never heard about that until I was grown up and I told her about it.
Probably a good thing.
Huh?
Probably a good thing you didn't tell her.
Oh, yeah. I don't know what would have happened, but I wrote that in my life history, and Mom read my life history. This
Oh,
was after I was grown and married.
yeah.
And I said, "What do you think of that?" And she said, "If I'd have known you damn kids were doing some of that stuff, I would have had a fit."
I'm sure she would.
You know, my mother, how she talked.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we used to do goofy things, and that wasn't a bad way to grow up, though.
Yeah.
The thing about it is, when you grow up in an environment like that, and you see things that little kids nowadays seldom see, especially kids in America,
Uh-huh.
you learn a lot of wisdom, like to keep your mouth shut and stay out of the way.
Yeah.
Don't mess with somebody. But if somebody messes with you, you don't have to back up. You know, you do whatever it takes to win.
Yeah.
And these kids at school would be fair and bounce around on their toes like boxers and stuff. That's all nonsense. If you're in a fight with somebody and you want to win it, you win it. And that
Yeah.
means you grab them by the hair or the ear or bite their ear off or kick them in the groin or whatever it takes. You want to fight, okay, but just remember, I don't fight fair.
Yeah.
Be prepared for what might happen.
Yeah.
And
And you
that's the
know,
way it was.
when it comes down to it, that's kind of real life. I
That is
mean,
real
when
life.
you're
And by the
surviving.
way, that held me in good stead those 4 years that I was a policeman
Yeah.
in Boise, because I knew that you don't expect some half drunk tough guy that wants to take on a policeman. You don't, you know, he's not going to spar around like a boxer.
Right.
He's going to come after you with a club or brass knuckles or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, be prepared for that. So,
Yeah. That was back in the 60s. So
yeah.
there were some rough customers running around Boise at that time.
Well, yeah, the thing about Boise was that in those days it was still a kind of a rough town, and maybe it is now. Nowadays, I think these guys that are mean and ornery, they all pack knives and guns and stuff.
Right.
Those days, they didn't. Once in a while, somebody'd have some brass knuckles, but that was pretty rare.
Yeah.
But it was just a different world, different time, different everything.
Now, when you were
I,
at Blackbird, Dad, did you attend school that when you were a little kid,
uh,
or
I
did you go
started
into
first
salmon?
grade. I started first grade at Blackbird,
Okay.
and we about partway through my first grade, we moved from there over to Coeur d'Alene country,
Oh,
and over in northern Idaho. Uncle Corky and Aunt Mildred were already over there, and they let Mom and Dad know that there's lots of jobs available and it was a good pay. And so we went there, and Dad worked there for a little while. I was still in the first grade,
uh-huh.
and then Lonnie got real sick, and old Doc Goggins diagnosed him as having rheumatic fever. He said the only way you can get this kid well, that was before wonder drugs were invented.
Right.
The only way to get him well is to take him a hot, dry climate,
Oh,
really hot. The hotter, the better. So we all packed up and moved to Arizona, and we lived there for about 9 months. And Lonnie got well, and we moved
interesting.
back to Idaho. So
And
anyway,
that's about the time when well, you moved to salmon at that time, and then grandpa went to work for the highway department, didn't
for
he?
the county.
The county.
Yeah, he worked for the county road department and ran a road grader on Williams Creek Summit in the winter and
Okay.
graded all over that country.
Yeah.
That was his job. He was operated a grader.
Yeah.
And so anyway, yeah, those were interesting times. Hard, hard times for everybody, but we didn't know they were hard. You know,
Yeah.
everybody was poor and everybody was hard workers. Everybody's dad had a job unless he was disabled because of something had happened to him and he couldn't work. But
Right.
that was in the days before welfare and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And if a man had a family, he went to work whether he liked it or not, and took care of his family.
Yeah. So in Cobalt, when you were a teenager, they probably had a little grocery store there and some other stuff, didn't they?
Yeah,
That
Walter
for
Harris.
families to shop.
Yeah, Walter Harris was he owned the Economy Grocery in Salmon.
Yeah.
He saw an opportunity there, and so he put a little grocery store out to Cobalt. And then he also owned the gas station.
Okay.
And so he made a lot of money off of that, I'm sure. So yeah, there was a little grocery store out there and you know, yeah, that was the way it was in Cobalt. That was after they built the town of Cobalt.
Yeah.
So what happened when I was a little kid, we lived at Blackbird Mine. And then we moved over to Coeur d'Alene and Arizona and everywhere else. And then when I was a teenager and came back, by then Cobalt was built up, and it was a town of about 2 or 3 thousand people, counting the
Yeah.
families and the miners and the mill workers and everybody.
Uh-huh.
And I spent my teenage years from the time I was about 11 until I was, oh, out of high school.
Uh-huh.
Well, till I was my senior year, I was up in Chalice. So until I was the end of my junior year at Cobalt, and I had a lot of experiences there. And those miners' kids were all rough, tough kids, just like the miner. Their dads were,
Yeah.
and they were good friends. Some of those guys are still good friends of mine. Haven't seen them in years, but
Well, what would those kids do? I mean, what was there in Cobalt for a kid to do to keep himself busy
well,
other than school?
they'd come to Salmon or go to Chalice for school in the
Okay.
winter. And Chalice had a boarding school, and Salmon you'd go live with somebody board at their house.
Okay.
But the Chalice school had a boarding school for those kind of kids.
Okay.
But anyway, what they'd do in the summertime when they weren't in school is they'd go fishing in the Panther Creek. And that was in the days when the salmon runs were still powerful.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know, I mean, I caught a lot of salmon.
Yeah.
We didn't use line and bait. We had our other special means of obtaining salmon out of Panther Creek. And we did that. And then up a couple of miles out of past Bruno's Cafe and Bar, there was a big slab there where there'd been a building on it, but it was a concrete slab. And us kids, I remember several times going up there and hate to tell you this, but it's true, so I guess I'll say it. We always were able to get all the beer we wanted.
Yeah.
Some kids' dads would buy it for us, and friends would buy it anyway. We all had beer, and we'd take our beer and a bunch of watermelons and go up to that slab and had a watermelon bus and a big dance. And usually all the kids from the age of about 12 or 13 until clear up through high school would run in a big crowd
Yeah.
and just had a lot of fun. There was probably about 40 or 50 kids at that age group. And we would spend Friday night and Saturday night partying, having a good time, going to the dance, the rec hall, and just enjoying ourselves
Yeah.
and watching the fights.
Yeah. Dad, was that slab right by the creek?
Yeah, yeah, it
I
was.
think I remember that. Was that there when I was a kid? I think
Yeah,
we
it
went up
was.
there.
Yeah, as far as I know, it's probably still there. Yeah, it was there.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of shanties.
Yeah.
Shanties, I mean little cabins along the creek, and they weren't the kind of cabin you see in a motel cabins thing. They were just shacks,
Right.
bar paper shacks. And some of the single miners would live in them because it was free.
Oh,
And, nobody owned them. They were just sitting there. So you'd move in and make up a. Anyway, but that slab was up there. And back in the day,
yeah. I think I remember that. We went up there just after we moved to Salmon from Boise. So this would have been the
yeah,
early 70s, 1970 probably.
yeah, I think Mom and I took you kids out there and showed you.
Yeah, I remember.
Cobalt is where I met and fell in love with your mother.
Yeah.
She came out there to stay with a friend of hers, and I saw her walking down the street and immediately fell in love. And here we are, 65, 66 years later, still in
Yeah.
love.
Well, thank goodness you did, because all of us kids are still here too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But they
Well,
were good
Dad,
times, and I could probably go on and on all night telling you stories about stuff that I saw. And one night Barley Fox and one of the Lee kids, I don't remember which one it was. Barley had a little coupe, Chevy coupe,
yeah,
and everybody had put their garbage can out on the street, on the edge of the street. And most of the garbage cans were 55-gallon barrels.
right.
And they'd set them out there so the garbage truck could come by the next morning and pick them up. And Barley was drunk, as usual, and they decided to knock all the garbage cans over. So he'd go about 40 miles an hour down the road, and the other kid would open the door and hit the garbage can with it, knock it end over end, garbage everywhere. And the next day, when Buck Allen, who was the deputy sheriff out there, kind of kept an eye on things, the next day, Buck Allen, something's happening to my computer here. There, it went away. Anyway, Buck Allen didn't have any trouble at all finding out who did that because the door on his Fox's car were all caved in.
Things you do when you're drunk, right?
Yeah, yeah, things you do. Unbelievable.
Yeah,
Harley Fox was one of those guys that everything that could go wrong did go wrong with him. For example, one night he went out. It was in the middle of the winter. It was like probably 20 below outside. Snow
yeah,
was about 3 feet deep. And he went out to get out to his car for something, and he never came back and never came back and never came back. And we went looking for him. And what he'd done is he went out that downstairs door in the rec hall, walked about 10 feet, and that cold air hit him. He was already drunk
yeah.
and knocked him out. And he fell down in the snow. And we went out there, and he's laying there full length in the snow. And we picked him up and carried him like carry a plank. That's how froze he was.
Oh, wow.
And the rec hall had a showers down in the downstairs part. We took him down and gave him a hot shower and thawed him out, and he finally woke up and stuff. Then we took him home in one of our cars, and he spent the next couple of weeks in the hospital in Salmon with pneumonia.
Thanks for listening. Growing up in Idaho, the good old days.